Professor Federica Goffi. He holds a PhD and MA in Religious Studies from the University of Ottawa and a Bachelor's of Architecture professional from Carleton University. He is recognized internationally for his work on the documentation and dissemination of ethnocultural methods of construction and building information, modeling for heritage, conservation, and architectural rehabilitation. His research areas also include architecture representation, architecture and religion, architecture and microhistory, and biomedical visualization.
Thanks, Anthony. All right, I'm just going to share my screen and get rolling. So, navigating the conundrums of digital knowledge creation. So what I'm going to address, or I guess my primary question today is not so much how, but why did I get, or we actually, with my colleagues at Carleton Immersive Media Studio, how did we get from imagining Canada's digital twin, which is something we're working on right now, and I'll talk about that near the end of my presentation, and how did I get there from there? And I'm going to spend a lot of time, most of my time, talking about this first project and how that really shaped the way I approach digital technologies and the potential and the power that they have to tell stories. I always come back to this quote by Rainer Banham, and I think it tells an implicit narrative about working with digital technologies. That, well, on the one hand, they have tremendous emancipatory potential. They will also change you as you move through and use them. Now, my road to this immersive media studio and my role there was rather a reluctant, had a reluctant beginning. I just finished my PhD. This is back in 2007, relatively soon. I was working on a book related to the PhD. And my then director and dear friend, Marco Foscari, asked me to take over the directorship of SIMS. And I said, Marco, I really have no interest in digital technologies. I'm interested in, churches. I'm interested in, bodies. My PhD dissertation was entitled Body Temple Metaphor in the Development of Early Christian Architecture. And he said, well, that's fine, go do something with churches and bodies, just use computers. So that seemed to make sense at the time. So off I went, and I'm going to talk about 4 intermittent trajectories that have happened since that journey began. So again, first of all, cultural diversity and material imagination in Saskatchewan architecture, CDMISA. Cultural diversity and material imagination in Canada's architecture, CDMICA. Quite proud to say 2 of the worst acronyms ever. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about everything that happened in between and point out something, newish project, which is a continuation of the first 2 called MIA. And then finally, I'm going to just touch on Canada's, imagining Canada's digital twin. So this first trajectory, CDMISA, was funded by the Saskatchewan Heritage Foundation, and it started back in 2008. And for the project, I hypothesized that immigrants who came to Canada would bring with them knowledge of ways of building. And they would bring that knowledge of building and an architectural imagination with them, but they may not have the materials or the tools that they would be used to using back in their native countries. So we did some research and found that Saskatchewan had the most diverse populations within a very close geographical proximity and a relatively narrow immigration window. And we narrowed that down to 1875 to 1925 as our area of study. And For those of you who are not familiar with the province of Saskatchewan, you can see it there. And Regina is the capital city. And essentially, we are in the middle of nowhere. Now, I had identified 9 culturally diverse properties. In the end, when I went out to Saskatchewan, we visited all 9 and found that actually only 5 were suitable. This is a view of the landscape, absolutely breathtaking. This is the iconic view of Saskatchewan and the grain elevators. It's primarily an agricultural area in the south, and in the north, it's north. This is one of the first properties that we looked at, St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Church, but we found it had been very poorly renovated with some vinyl siding, so it didn't really fit for our study. This is St. George's, I believe. It's a Romanian Catholic church, absolutely beautiful little building. This is the interior, absolutely priceless artworks. But we found that actually it had been reclad and actually moved off of its original foundation. So it wasn't really suitable for our purposes either. This is the Bekovar church. Again, it had been very badly renovated inside. So that left us with 5 buildings. This is the Beth Israel Synagogue, finished with Pacific red cedar on the interior at great expense, I would imagine. This is a Swedish Presbyterian church, absolutely beautiful little building built by boat builders, floating on some stones on the prairie, absolutely lovely. But the one I really want to focus on today is St. Michael's of Ponat's Lake. Now, again, this is the surrounding landscape, mostly clouds. On a couple of occasions, we actually saw tornadoes in the area. It's absolutely breathtaking. And the way we found this building, and this is an important part of the story, we drove into town and drove to a local tavern and walked inside. It was a Sunday. Tavern was open, and it was around noon, and the bartender was sitting behind the bar by herself. And we asked her if she knew where St. Michael's church was. She said, "Is that the one with the big silver ball on top?" We said, yes, it is. So she said, just go down the road and take a left, and then go up the road and then take a right, and you can't miss it. So off we went across the prairie, and we saw this silver dome on the landscape after following her directions. So we stopped, and it turned out it was a church picnic. What was absolutely amazing was that they have this annual picnic one time per year. And that's the only time that this church, it's a Ukrainian Catholic church, Babalins, it's the only time of year that the church is actually occupied. And this is the interior, built in 1931, absolutely beautiful. Interior looking up, God's eye looking down at you. So we were invited for lunch, of course, and they made some fun of us because we were from Ottawa, the capital city. They said, "Oh, you must be here to help." And I said we were looking for St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Church, and someone said, "Well, it's on that person's land right over there." So again, strangely fortuitous that this would happen. So I went over, introduced myself, and the person said, "Oh, I'd love to show you the church. Come on, follow me." On my way to this man's truck, a woman stopped me and said, "Are you here to see her?" I said, "Excuse me, ma'am, but I'm not sure who she is." She said, "Her," and she gave me this card, which I still carry with me in my wallet. So off we set again across the prairie in a stranger's pickup truck, and there it was in the middle of a wheat field, St. Michael's Ukrainian Catholic Church. And here it is, absolutely exquisite little building. Our information said it was made out of logs, but when we got there, it appeared to be made out of a shiplap. The bell tower is just to the right. And this is the interior. And all of this artwork that you see is essentially calendar art. So just rather inexpensive paper. And all of the fit up, including that tabernacle, is all handmade, locally made. You can see the image of St. Michael in the background there, the painting. And the story is that this painting was purchased and donated to the church by a man who used to work on Sundays. And as penance for his not observing the Lord's day, he bought the church this painting. This is looking back towards the nave. You can see it's a very small space, maybe 300 square feet. This is up from the, 400 square feet. And this is looking up from the balcony up above. Now, we asked the owner, the person whose land the building was on, about the log construction, and he said, oh, yeah, it is made out of logs, and there's some similar buildings over here on my grandfather's homestead. So he took us over and he showed us this type of log construction, which is typical to a very specific part of the Ukraine, which is actually the Limco region. And it turns out that Peter Limco was this man's grandfather that was showing us around. And he was one of the 7 people who built the church. And this is the area you can see the Limco region is just up on the top. You see where the word Poland, just below there is the Limco region. So we did have a laser scanner at this point. Again, this is one of my first documentation projects. I was there with a student, Evan Dysart, and so we used our hands and tape measures. We took some photographs. We also had a total station with us, so we recorded some of the key points with the total station. This is the AutoCAD image generated from the total station data. This is the plan of the building and a section. And this is a timeline of the construction, how it went from a log building to a shiplap, and then the subsequent additions, the construction of the bell tower. Now, one other interesting story that we heard associated with the building was that Anne Limco was actually a Ukrainian Catholic, but Peter Limco was actually an Orthodox Christian. Now, if you're not familiar with the hostilities between those two factions, you can just maybe check it out on Wikipedia. But Peter built the church for his wife to worship him, and he left the Orthodox faith. Now, this building was about 2 kilometers from St. Michael's, and it's actually, again, quite an exquisite structure. It was started in 1951 using drawings that were produced in the Ukraine. And I'm not going to go into it in detail, but from this small little prairie town, again, middle of nowhere, some international intrigue begins to unravel. At the time, Russia was actually sending spies over, some of them Orthodox priests, who were trying to convert people who had gone to Ukrainian Catholicism to the Orthodox Church, and in that way cause some political disruption in the Canadian West. So this group who started building this church were part of that clandestine movement. This is the interior. The building was never finished. In 1953, there was so much flooding in the area that the farmers who were building it just left their farms. They abandoned their farms. So the building was never finished. This is the cross bracing up above in the ceiling. Absolutely incredible structure. This building no longer exists. About 2 years after we were there, it just collapsed. Another interesting development in the story is we went into the basement of this building and we found a window still in its packing crate. And written on that window was for Mr. William Limco. Now, William Limco was Peter Limco's brother, and he was one of the key players in building this Orthodox church. And Peter and William had a falling out, and they never spoke to each other again. Now, another component of this story is her, Virgin. And in 1995, the church was struck by lightning. And there was some quite significant damage. But most significantly is that the building started on fire. And as it burned, the fire began to engulf this image of the Virgin. But before it actually, before the flames reached her image, the fire went out. So, and this is a photograph of the actual image that was saved by fire. You can see that some water damage and the edges are frayed. This is some evidence that the parishioners have left in the church. Some of the damage from the lightning, it even blew out the tacks that were holding the carpet in place. That's the force of the lightning. But it was decided that the Virgin actually was responsible for saving the building. And that image, again, which is, as far as the quality of the image was inexpensive calendar art, it is now a recognized icon in the Ukrainian Catholic Church. And the image is paraded every year. So that is the story of St. Michael's of Lonass Lake. And what's interesting about it is, to my mind, or what I found interesting about it, and actually not just interesting, but revelatory, is that in this little tiny building in the middle of nowhere, there was a link to international politics and to the divine that came together in this building. And this is something I came to find. I came to find how the building was made and who made it. I discovered all of these other, this other whole network of narratives linked to this place. So along the way, shortly after this project, I was introduced to building information modeling. This is 2009. And I realized that no one was using building information modeling for documenting heritage. And I saw an enormous potential in the capacity to link architectural geometry with a database or databases. And within those databases, there could certainly be information about the building, materials, and methods of construction, but there could also be all of those other types of narratives. So this led us to cultural diversity, material imagination in Canada's architecture. So we took that idea of architecture, its materials, methods, and then expanded that to something that could reach across the country. And what structured this application was the relationship between the typical, so something that one would find in a builder's manual, and the as found. And my thinking was, in the typical, one finds the mechanics of how something should be built. But in the as found, one finds how something was actually built. And in that, and the speculation was, can one then begin to imagine what kind of aspirations, cultural aspirations were brought to this building, extraneous to the actual physical construction. So we began to work on timelines. We began to work on building these typical details to compare them to our as found details. And we began to develop a database that was available and actually still is available online. I'm going to come back to this. That actually documents all of these materials, methods of construction. This is kind of how we imagined it in the beginning. I'm not going to go through all of this, but this is back in 2009, 10, and we imagined that you could have this 3D model, and then you could have links to it, and you could look at the links to actual photographs of the existing conditions. You can look at its framing, different methods of construction. In fact, we were actually unable to build this at the time and put it on a web-based application. The other aspect of this project that had a huge influence is we started recording. We wound up purchasing a laser scanner, and we started recording larger and larger areas and looking at how not just how buildings went together, but actually how neighborhoods, and in this case, this is Ashton, Ontario, just outside of Ottawa, how these, how towns, heritage towns actually started to come together. So again, I just want to go through this very quickly. This led to a number of large scale projects. This is a project, for the first complete town. This is the town of Battawa, which is a factory town for Bata shoes in Canada. This was 600 hectares. And again, we built a historical model of the factory, the various phases of renovation. And then we basically mapped and modeled the entire town and surrounding landscape, 600 hectares. That led us to our next large scale project, which was for a First Nations community, the Genzibi, which Algonquin peoples. And this project was 18,000 hectares. What we did is made a combination of building information modeling of all of their primary assets, including underground utilities. And then we linked that to a GIS database and then built a dedicated browser where you could search between the GIS data and the BIM data. Of course, those technologies are much more friendly today than they were back in 2011. And this project, I must say I was very honored to work on it, is the Parliament Buildings of Canada. And we started working on the West Block, which is this building here in 2012. I continued into 2015, and then we started this building also in 2015, and this building and the topography. That took us to 2017, and actually we're now working with the architectural consultants who are doing a rehabilitation on the center block and supporting them in a number of different ways. So 3.1, everything that came in between, and multimedia inventory of architectural heritage. And this project is a continuation of the CDMICA and CDMISA initiatives. And I would invite you to visit the website. It's been recently relaunched. It looks beautiful, thanks to Adam Weigert and Laura Chow and Usma. Again, it allows you to search through assemblies, details, documents, different materials, all related to heritage, architectural heritage. And so finally, I'm just going to end here. Where has this all brought us? It's brought us to imagining Canada's digital twin. And if you're not familiar with the technology, just in a nutshell, what it is a real thing, digital thing, and then censored data or communication between the digital and the physical, and a real or near real-time exchange of that data. And this is something we've been working on at a smaller scale, at a campus scale, and now we're thinking, okay, what could this be at a national scale? And of course, when we start scaling up to this system, things like inclusivity and multidisciplinarity and multicultural have to become key concerns. So I just want to conclude by suggesting that what you see outside depends on which window you're looking through. Whether you're looking through a small window in rural Saskatchewan, or you're looking out the window of the International Space Station. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Steve. Those are great stories that you probably unearthed when doing the process. And definitely, I'm looking forward to the conversation later where we can talk about this a little bit more. But at this moment, I would like to call on Anudarya to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Samwit Tatta.
Thank you. Hi. So Dr. Samwit Tatta is a professor of computational design at Curtin University, based in the School of Electrical Engineering, Computing, and Mathematical Sciences in the Bentley campus. He works across the university in the disciplines of design, computer science, architecture, and built environment, and urban science. His research group, Computational Design Research Laboratory, Code Lab, is developing new computational processes and tools for architectural and urban reconstruction, focusing on the development of novel computational techniques His current research is contributing to our understanding of design, spatial geometry, and urban form. A recipient of the prestigious Michael Ventures Memorial Award from the Institute of Classical Studies, Cambridge, and the Architectural Association in London. And I'll hand it over to him.
Thank you, Anadaria, for that introduction. I hope you can hear me. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see? Okay. So thank you to Stephen for a wonderful introduction to the problems of navigating the conundrums of digital knowledge creation. I guess I have a similar view that it depends on which window you're looking out of. And today I'm going to basically focus on a very simple proposition whose motivation here is to look at Indian temple architecture over a long period of time, 400 or 500 years, spread over a large geography, which is basically starting from the west coast of India, or perhaps the salt ranges in Pakistan, right down to the edges of Vietnam. So it's perhaps not as ambitious as Canada's digital twin, but has quite a large spread. And so today what I want to do is to share with you some of the work that I've been doing in trying to understand this architecture and its spread over 400 years, typically around 400 to 1100, 500-600 years actually. So the second motivation is that I'm very deeply interested in digital reconstruction, not only of heritage objects, but in the nature of the digital object itself. And I hope to give you some understanding of how digital representations can be used in a number of different ways. And finally, from the heritage perspective, I'm very much interested in the role of these heritage monuments and their socioeconomic role. And I think Stephen's first project in Saskatchewan shows some of that aspect of heritage as cultural capital, built heritage, and their importance in living communities. And some of the temples that I've worked on right across Asia are embedded in living communities. And finally, I'm very much interested in environmental knowledge that some of these monuments, though not in use, actually can tell us about how the land is used in terms of water, land, and place. But today I'll restrict myself to talking about the conundrums of digital knowledge creation on 3 topics. And what I want to do is I want to start with the first conundrum, which is the conundrum of reproducibility. What that essentially means is that when you create something digital, you reproduce. In our case, it's usually buildings, it could be artifacts, and they tend to have their own time and place and context. And as Walter Benjamin calls it, these are unique objects with aura. And when you reproduce them, you somehow change them. So I'll talk about that. And then I'm also interested in variability and similitude as the second problem or conundrum, if you like, that I face. And that is that the digital object is very mutable, and it is possible to vary it in a number of different ways, and in ways that we're only just beginning to discover in some sense. And it also lends itself to operations of comparison in very deep, and Stephen mentioned databases, and we'll come back to that. And then finally, I want to finish off with talking about curation and collections of objects, digital objects, which also Stephen has worked on, which is great, and talk about how do we locate these objects in space and in time, and what do they mean for us, and how do we curate it for others, and what do these collections mean. So I'm going to start by talking about the reproducibility of the digital object through one project that I've been working on for a long period of time, and that has occupied, this is the temple of Ranak Devi in Wadhwan, built in 960 AD. It's a stone temple. and I think it was finished around 980. So it's about 1100 years old, carved in stone, built in the classical North Indian temple style with a beautiful superstructure, a very simple cuboidal cella, which is basically blank cube, which sits inside this object, and a very ornate exterior. So this particular photograph has deep significance because it was taken by a gentleman called Henry Cousins, who worked for the Archaeological Survey of India. And he took this photograph shortly after the invention of photography in 1898, so about 110 years ago. And we were very fortunate to have access to this photograph from the British Library of this particular temple. So essentially, this is a long time span. This building has been standing for 1100 years. It is no longer in use. And I guess I want to demonstrate the reproducibility of the digital object by talking about this temple and my attempts over many years to reconstruct it over and over again with different techniques. And so essentially, it starts with field surveys and measure drawings, very similar to what Steve showed in Saskatchewan. You go to the site, but this was in 1991. There were no total stations, but we had drawing boards and graph paper and pencil. And so the project really was to try and document this temple. And it actually sits here near Ahmedabad, if you know where it is, on the west coast of India. And it is a small rural town, about 100 kilometers west of Ahmedabad. So the field drawings in 1991, which was really part of my undergraduate thesis, actually constituted the bulk of my final year thesis, was to draw this temple. And that's what I did. I managed to achieve that, through pen, paper, pencil, graph paper, and so on, and manual drawings. And my thesis was about the geometry of the Nagara cella, which this particular temple was an example of. So the reproducibility in that sense was very traditional, very classical. You do field work, you use pencil and tools that you're familiar with. And of course, in that period of time, the computer was only just beginning to appear in India. And, we did, I think, have AutoCAD and so on, but not many people were using it, and it certainly wasn't taught. So the next step was really to, the problem that I faced here was that I couldn't really model the complex geometry of this object to my satisfaction manually. So no matter how hard I tried to document it, because it had this tremendous curvature, which I didn't really understand at that time, and took me many years to do so. And also it had this incredible ornate stone carving, very, very complicated. And the more I looked at it, the more complicated it appeared. And so I gave up on manual methods and decided that I would investigate using the computer to model it. And I had some success by using 3D modeling inside, wireframe modeling, basically inside AutoCAD. And then I wrote a little grant, which I did win. And I had, I think, a copy of Mathematica where I could do mathematical modeling of this curvature. At the same time, in parallel to this, I was also reading about the canonical, as Stephen called it, the typical versus the as found. So in this case, the typical would be the canonical rules of Indian architecture. And there was a lot of literature which described how prescriptive it was, And so reading through, I had no access to the Sanskrit terminology or the texts, but I had access to journal articles and scholarship in English. So there was a particular book written in 1946 called The Hindu Temple by Stella Cramrish, who had deciphered and read a number of these texts and put down, in English, the sequences of construction and so on. So this led to my understanding, the study of the scholarship of the field led to an understanding of the curvature of this particular temple. And subsequently, of course, as I moved along, I was able to document not only the motifs, but also the carvings in great detail, and also to understand and control the measure and variation of the curvature and its, of the tilings, and develop sort of computational tools or what I call scaffolds to try and explain what was happening in this 10th century superstructure. And yes, so one of the interesting things about this was that as we went along, the progress of the technological tools was very rapid. I'm talking about the early 2000s, and you had it was no longer simply wireframe modeling. You had parametric modeling, you had generative modeling, you had photogrammetry. You could do lots of things with new tools. Still very difficult to access, but they were available. And so one of the things that I started to do was to visualize the canonical rules or aphorisms. They were usually written in text. So these buildings had no drawings, I should mention. They were built out of textual descriptions. And they were pretty much like algorithms as we would understand them today. They told you in 3 or 4 lines in a sort of what we call a sutra, a poem, how to make something, or what the relationship between parts, the plan and the section is, or how to cut and measure a piece of stone. So I was then able to create with parametric modeling algorithms myself with the new tools to try and take the textual descriptions in these 6th century texts and turn them into geometric objects. So this was a very interesting sort of development in this point of studying this temple, because previously I was trying to solve an architectural problem of documentation with technology, and really it was motivated by the temple. But now I was starting to use the potential of the new technology to expand my understanding of the architecture and its possibilities. So this was a really important shift, I guess, in the conundrums. And so then I started to generate the temple and its logic using the computer, completely independent of what was available. So you might say that I was using a typical rather than an as-found model. And also starting to do 3D prints. 3D printers were becoming quite common. And I happened to be in the University of California, Berkeley, which had a fantastic 3D printer. And I was able to very quickly translate some of my motifs and models into physical form. And that opened up a whole new area of work. So for the first time, we could, instead of treating these as objects, which were in the field, we were able to then have a corporeal, 3D prints that we could observe and study and analyze in the laboratory. So this was, again, the start of the technology overtaking, in some sense, the study of the object itself. So I guess it then led to a process or a method by which we could work. The first one was to generate a scaffold from the text. We would read the text and we would use the grids and the curvature profiles, and I won't go into great detail. And we also had the ability now to have 3D point clouds, from images, so photo-based modeling. So we had very accurate renderings of these objects. And then we started to construct planar dissections, have a great deal of accuracy around using these planar dissections to make 3D models. And so now we could generate practically the entire structural system inside this object underneath the tiling here. If I just show you very quickly, just trying to be, so this is the underlying structure of the tiling, and you see that this is really the carving on top of it. So we could then take this and turn it and look inside to see what it was like, and therefore we could have abstract models. So the oriented planar dissections, was something that we started to develop. And so today, what is happening is that we are working very much in the computer science area to look at representations of these objects. And this is a temple in South India, which is in Chinglipet. And here is a model of this temple. And we use voxel representations at different levels of detail. This is a colleague of mine who's just finished his PhD at IIT Kharagpur in India. And he works on identifying by slicing this model up on the various parts at various layers to give you an, where the computer actually detects the parts. So there is no manual segmentation, we call it, which is the subdivision of a model, a temple into its constituent parts. And his technique is able to recognize parts of temples, symmetries, similarities, similitude, without recourse to manual means. So it's quite a change, if you will, from the way in which we worked previously. So the next thing was really expanding this. So we started there, as I mentioned, in the west of India, but there was a huge spread of temples. And we were saying, well, if we can look at these temples here, perhaps we could link them to the older temples. Perhaps there are links between these temples. And perhaps we can say something about the large number of temples that occur in Southeast Asia. So David Benn and my colleague from the University of Tasmania and I worked for a number of years, which really translated into this book on the stone and brick temples across South and Southeast Asia, which basically took some of these techniques from that one reproducible object and started to ask questions about collections. How do you collect things? And that particular piece of work led us to translating those 500 years of temple building, as I mentioned, in one page across India, Java, and Cambodia. And we were able to look at a magnificent set of temples with a similar logic, similar canon, similar but very, very different architectural styles. And we were able to analyze and in the digital realm to put them together into a catalog. And I think we were very pleased with that. So the third part of my conversation really is around talking about collections and curation. So how do you actually, what do you do with these objects? They're great objects for, academic scholarship, but how do you then translate this to people who would like to view them or even explain them to others? And so we worked in the Hive, which is a large laboratory for immersive visualization that Stephen probably is aware of. And I won't go into too much detail, but to say that we decided that we would keep the abstract nature of our work. We were really talking about a digital object. We didn't want to recreate completely. We wanted to have sections. We wanted to have a very abstract, almost dematerialized, and put it as a model, as you would as scale model. But we also did put them inside virtual galleries. So, you have rooms that you can walk through and you have temples, and we've tried a number of these projects, virtual galleries with these objects and their, and perhaps I'll just play a quick video here. I don't know if I can. Yep. So if I just play this, you can see that it's an immersive, stereoscopic tool, and it has infrared, so you can infrared connections, so you can move around and navigate it and go from one temple to the other in a large space in a cylindrical hall, half cylinder, semi-cylinder. And it gives you that sense of immersion. And this was one of the experiments that we did. It was quite successful. So coming now to the last piece of work that we are currently doing, which I mentioned a little bit, which is about taking temples across from different cultures, not necessarily located in their culture, but across and trying to find ways to classify and compare them. And again, we are working with a fairly detailed techniques where we turn these models into voxels, and then we analyze every layer. So this is the temple, and this is the lowest level, and this is the highest level. So if I use the laser, this is the base, so the computer algorithm then studies every layer from bottom to top and provides a signature of the difference between the consecutive layers. And using that, we can then classify them into parts. So in this case, we do a 3-part subdivision where we recognize the base, the body, and the superstructure. But we're just only beginning to understand how these signatures of the geometry of temples can be used to identify the digital object. So this is sort of emerging work. And finally, I want to just conclude by going back to the Temple of Ranak Devi. Hope I've given you some idea of how we navigate some of these conundrums that we've talked about. So really the issue is that you've got the sacred, Walter Benjamin's aura, object, which is unique. And then you've got the digital object, which is made of bits and is not so unique. You can, as I showed you today, you can vary this ad nauseum. Now, we don't try to replicate because we can't, because what we try to do is we try to reproduce, we try to use variability, comparison, and when we put the two together, we hope to create collections that will say something about the original. So I guess that's where I'll stop and hand over back to Pallavi, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you, Samwit and Steve. Again, I would say this kind of not a binary, but some kind of differentiation between two poles, if we can call it so, is striking me. The product versus process. Steve, you talked about the politics versus the divine, the idea of the tangible and the intangible. And these are very fascinating and definitely contribute towards making it the conundrum of such a process. And on that note, I would like to invite both of you and to hear some of your thoughts after listening to each other, and probably also even talking about your own work and the thoughts that come forth. And it'll be very interesting to hear both of you on that.
Thank you, Pallavi. I'd like to open with a question about the relationship between the atom and the bit. What is that relationship?
Fantastic question, Steve. I wish I could answer it, but I probably answer it with another question. It's about, the way I see it is that, if you go back to the kind of artifacts that we work with, they're originals in a sense, they're unique. If you look at the churches in Saskatchewan or any building, that's put together, it's really designed to be atomic in nature. It's physical, right? So it has its place, it has a time. And as I mentioned, Walter Benjamin calls it the aura of the object. The icon that you talked about becomes sacred in some sense. And even if you remove it to a museum, it still maintains, the atom still maintains. Now, the moment we take it to the bit, in my view, you have displaced that relationship, and you can't say that it has the same aura or it is the same object. And so this is something that I struggled with, because the first thing that I did was to try and replicate everything as, we see it in the physical bit world. In the atom world, you try to replicate every atom. And so your energies are spent in trying to make it as accurate or as close to the original as possible. But then you realize that you can never get there, because you'll never, ever, philosophically impossible, right? You can't locate it. You cannot get the sacredness or the divine, no matter how well you model it. And so then you come to the realization that the bit is very different. And then you try to play on the strengths of the bit, and that's, I guess, how I see it.
Mm-hmm. I suppose my approach has been to use the bit, try and see the aura. I mean, I agree with you 100%. The bit can never capture the atom. It can only reflect it. But I suppose, and this is where I see our work kind of diverging, perhaps, is that you're questioning the bit, and I'm still trying to find the aura. And perhaps you're content. That's true. Perhaps you're content to leave the aura alone. You don't want to, but I just feel like poking it. I don't.
No, I think I totally agree. I mean, in the sense that the bit is limitless in its possibilities. So, why can't it reach, the level of singularity that, the atom has? And 3D printing was going to be the great promise, well, is the great promise that you could go from the, bit to the atom. So therefore now we've gone two ways, and so therefore we will now have it. But the interesting thing was I showed a very clean fragment of a temple in a lecture in India. And I thought I had nailed it. Now I would construct temples. I would repair every single temple in the country, and I would have all these commissions. And I was dreaming about all the 3D prints that I would be doing. But the simple question that was asked is, it looks so lifeless and perfect. There is no imperfection. And so the adaptation of, the bit to the atom to make something physical from the digital itself is a very limiting exercise. And then you have to start fiddling with saying, okay, it can't be that perfect. I need to be able to add errors in it or make it human-like in some way. So you're constantly chasing that aura, and it's always going to be a little bit further away, I think, in my view. But with the digital twin that your work shows, I mean, how do you, that is a very interesting one, because now you're talking about a correspondence with the sensor data going backwards and forwards from the physical to the bit. And that's a whole new relationship that I have not had the privilege of exploring. So maybe you could talk a little bit about, how you see the two-way linkage in that particular instance.
Mm-hmm. Frankly, I find it thrilling and terrifying at the same time, because once you introduce that interaction, that conversation, all of the concerns that regulate human interaction suddenly need to start to regulate machine, or the regulation of bits, because now suddenly they're genetically different, but functioning in the same body. So again, questions of ethics, questions of governance, which in our, in the documentation of architectural heritage, I was never, certainly ethics were a concern, but data governance was never really a concern. It was something that you could fit into a fairly neat package. But the concept of the digital twin, I mean, the twin is almost alive. So this is something, I mean, the project is really still very nascent. And we're only 1 year into thinking about this. And what we're calling it, Imagine Canada's Digital Twin, is we gave ourselves a window to say, okay, like what could or should or might this thing be? We're not going to try to make it, certainly, in 2 years. What are the possibilities, and what are the obstacles? So I agree. It's a whole new array of concerns. I want you to come back for 1 second to the fabrication using 3D printing. I didn't touch on it today, but we have been doing some fabrication work as well, except we've been doing subtractive fabrication. So we have a couple of robots. And what we found is the only way to approach the aura is to become bits, from atoms to bits to atoms, and then the human hand has to touch those atoms. That's the only way to breathe from spirit back into the object.
Yeah. No, I think it also reminds me in a sense of, the philosopher Karl Popper, who said, his theory about scientific inquiry, So his understanding was that, largely, if you look at it, all scientific theories are largely false, right? Because falsifiability is the test of the strength of a theory. So I think it's the same thing with models that we make. it's until it's proven to be false, it's the best thing that we've got, you know. And when the next thing comes along, well, we'll say it was false anyways. So it was a false hope. But you know, in the 30 years that I have been working on it, and that, you know, technology continuously progresses and continuously proves the naysayers wrong. You know, you keep moving. You know, we haven't stopped moving. But to say that yes, this is it, you know, is obviously not going to you know, put a finality to it. You know, the narrative between the bits and the atoms will continue to go, but there'll be a simulation. And one of the issues that I have with repositories, I mean, you've built a very incredible repository of architectural heritage, is the datedness of these things. How do you actually keep them alive, you know, to use you know, how do you keep them moving? And I think the computer science have solved the problem, you know, in some sense, because if you look at their repositories, they're all open, right? They have standards, and if something dies or is alive or is kept alive, it's because a community of practitioners is making sure that it's going to continue or die. So it's basically Darwinian in its you know, origins. So I guess the same thing with digital heritage. So I always, you know, I started the first in 1995 in Singapore. We did a virtual heritage archive, you know, with VR models, and you know, it was fantastic. 1990, you know, mid 90s. And the day we finished our project, or the week that we finished our project, 18 months into the project, we built a database, and you could query an image, and an image would crop up, so on. The web, you know, the World Wide Web was released. I mean, the Mozilla, sorry, it was, I don't remember what it was called. It wasn't Mozilla, it was before that. It was the first browser from Chicago that came out, you know, and that was it. It completely bypassed, in a Darwinian way, what we had spent 2 years doing, because now anyone could do it. And it's the same thing with photogrammetry, with laser scanning. You know, I would spend months making photogrammetric models, putting points everywhere, which I'm sure you've done too.
Yeah.
And now someone says, you know, a young student will say, so what's cool about that? I can do it on my phone, you know? Yeah. And so, you know, this whole process in which the speed with which technology changes means that whatever we do is bound to be falsified, you know? So that's the point I take, but it doesn't mean that it's useless. You know, it's about continuing to progress.
Agreed.
And I don't know if you would want to specify, Steve, if you're calling this digital twin that you're developing for Canada an identical twin or a fraternal twin.
Well, perhaps conjoined would be the best.
Conjoined, yes, that's another category. I agree. But do you think in this duality of the bit and the atom, can the process be incorporated? So for example, when you're talking about, there is a question from one of our audience also, I think, which talks to the same effect. The question from Tina Patel, who says, thank you for sharing your research, Steve. I was particularly intrigued by how you explored the jewels in Saskatchewan, and which is now on my bucket list. My question is, how did you record these stories in the digital repository, the stories that you were narrating? I think the whole idea of the process that you were going through, is that evident in your final model that you put on in your repository?
Mm-hmm. This is a very difficult question, because during those trips to Saskatchewan, I did interviews with people who knew the buildings, knew the people who had built the buildings. One story from the gentleman told us, yep, the floor joists under here are 12 foot long, one piece, of Douglas fir. And I said, how did you know that? Well, my grandfather built this place and he told me. So we actually climbed under there, and they were not 12 foot, one single piece at all. So, I mean, there were those kinds of many of those kinds of stories. But I did those stories without planning to do those stories. And I did not have ethics clearance. And I cannot use those stories. No. So this is a conundrum. Because I didn't anticipate that those, again, I went out there with a kind of an almost instrumental mission. You know, I'm going to measure these buildings and say, I'm going to, you know, here's the building, and then I'm going to compare it to what it should be, and we're going to see a difference. But when I got there, it wasn't like that, and I wasn't prepared for that. So this is still something that we need to resolve. And Samwit, I'm sure it's the same at your university. I mean, in order to use things like that, you have to anticipate the question. You have to know the questions that you're going to ask in advance. And you have to know every person that you're going to speak to, and you have to get permission to use that information. But life just, when you're in the field, it just isn't like that. So a lot of information can't be used. So that's a very heartbreaking question.
Mm.
Samwit, would you like to add something to that?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same experience. You know, the whole research culture of ethics around what you do, how you do it, that it's, you know, it doesn't lend itself to kind of design research and the creative research that we do in our field. It's not meant, it's meant to be, if you're working with mice, yes, you know, you know, are you following ethics? And, you know, if you're dealing with human subjects, yes. Well, we do deal with human subjects, but the point is that I think what Stephen is referring to is that the creative license, if you will, you know, to make changes. The research, you know, structures don't allow that really to grow, especially in very large projects, you know. And the temple is the one that I spoke of today, but I also work on other areas, you know, and it's particularly hard to embed innovation, you know, design innovation or research-driven innovation, if you will, in the construction industry, which is, you know, similar to the research industry, if you will, is very much driven by convention, right? So this is another big conundrum, you know. So they want to see technologies and the relationship between technologies and progress in their disciplines as a conventional structure, you know, the typical. And so you need to do more research to ensure that that happens. But in our discipline, I don't think we have that kind of backing, you know, if you will, or you know, it's still a very nascent field. Design research is very nascent. It's not very old. You know, in our lifetimes, I mean, you know, we've done PhDs, but we are probably the rarity rather than the exception, the norm in our field, right? Most of the research would be in professional practice or in true practice, you know, creative practice. So definitely dealing with issues where it's very structured, the questions have to be known before you go to the field is very difficult. And there are moves in Australia where we do have, you know, the creative practice research community, which I'm sure you have in Canada as well, that tries to go around some of these barriers. But in the work that Steve and I do, which has a lot of scientific computing, you know, infrastructure, machines, site work, I think those same constraints apply.
We also have another question from our YouTube viewer, Zarin Singh, and she asks, what science is this and how did you create algorithms? I would like to add to that, is it, and probably bringing back to the same idea of the tangible and the intangible. How do you create algorithms? Is it a science or an art, or what is it?
I think it's a bit of both. So it's a very good question. And, you know, when we say algorithm, it's a procedural, you know, way of looking at the built environment, which is not the normal way of looking at it. So it's a repeatable procedure. That's what an algorithm is. Now, what science is this? I would say that we call it computational design. So it comes from both design, which deals with form, shape, color, material, and objects, and computer science, which deals with making things repeatable and predictable and generative. So I guess it's it's a nascent science, and it's called computational design, in answer to your question. And you will find a lot of literature around it. Some of it maybe you may have seen all the fancy sort of curvatures and things that people work with, and there is some of that, and there's also a lot of science behind that in the research field. And there's quite a bit of literature that you can look up. But yeah, I don't know if that answers the question.
Definitely. Steve, do you want to add anything to that question?
Maybe only anecdotally. A couple of years I was at Autodesk University, and Autodesk had just launched something that they call Forge. And it was at the end of the conference, and I was standing beside an engineer from Autodesk who I didn't know, and I asked him, just like in plain speak, can you explain Forge to me? And he said, it's a platform where there is no more independent software. You come to the Forge and you say, I want something that is 1.1 meters off the ground. I want it to have a single cylinder that touches the floor. And I want to be able to put a glass of milk on the top of it. Show me my possibilities. So the idea of an object disappears. It is just your, really the deconstructed geometry of a function. And then the Forge gives you back, do you want 1,000 variations? And I mean, coming back to so I see computational design as, again, an incredibly new and exciting frontier, because it changes the way we think about design. And of course, those, there are those who are very nervous about that, because they they have their pencil and their transparent tracing paper, and they sketch through 50 or 60 variations of the plan. And what this is saying, what computational design is saying, like, just tell us what the parameters are and we'll do all that sketching for you. And then through a series of decisions, you say, actually, this one and this one and this one, those seem to make the most sense. And then those are synthesized and further developed. So I think it's quite exciting.
Yeah, I have a view on that, Stephen, and that is a theoretical one. I think that, in some senses, I feel AutoCAD is putting the cart before the horse, right? In a classic way, because my sense is that what they're interested in the platform is to try and get as many people to adopt this view for maybe a commercial reason, or maybe, for a market-driven incentive. But theoretically, yes, it's possible. But we haven't yet developed a lot of the theory of computational science or computational design, And I feel that's where the weakness is. We are not linking to the theoretical side of this whole problem. Architects are not engaging. They're engaging with the tools. They're engaging with the available, marketing that is coming out of the software companies. And fundamentally, the question that I always ask is, okay, so if that's true, why don't you just open all your source so we can see it and we can all share it, and we can also end up programming it, and let's all be communitarian in this, since it's such a fundamental shift, why hold it within your companies, and that doesn't make sense, to me. So I think it's very, very important to see, and it's the same thing with all the platforms, right? Google's the same. We're having a big fight with Google on advertising and media between Australia. So it's a big issue, I'm sure. With Facebook has stopped news in Australia, because the whole question is larger than the architectural fraternity. But I think the GIS community, as you mentioned, GIS, I feel that they are pretty much in the forefront of at least developing the theory and having control and governance about what, you don't want Autodesk to tell you that now you only speak and only verbal commands will give you whatever you want, and the rest is, we'd like to be part of that, as intellectuals or as academics and as theory, people who want to develop theory. So I think the theory is very nascent and undeveloped. It's very much the tool. And that's been the tragedy of the last 30 years of, digital architecture, if you will, since the Frank Gehry, advances right down to what you see today. And the other day I was in a conference and someone said, we're in the post-digital era. Really? We haven't even begun, So I have issues with that. There's not enough theory there. There's a lot of, yeah. And you would appreciate that, Steve.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't want to get into slamming Autodesk on YouTube. But, I'm not sure if you've seen the recent letter to Autodesk from some of the larger practices, global practices, saying exactly what you're saying. And, and even more specifically about Revit.
Yeah.
That the license fees keep going up, but the product isn't improving.
Yeah. Poor architects are supporting the 4th largest software company in the world, and I have no hesitation in saying that. It's just, in 1999 at MIT, I proposed that we form a consortium, which every school of architecture puts $10,000 a year. And if every school of architecture in the world did that, we would have enough money to build a free tool.
Yes.
It's as simple as that. It's economic. It's logical. So I think that the practices are doing it because it's hurting their bottom line. But I think as academics, we need to do it because that's the right thing to do. To find a way to get out of this vicious cycle of paying for software. That there's no problem with paying for software, but the problem really is that it's crippling. In terms of the fees, and even small practices are struggling. And they don't have access to the tools that should normally have been developed at universities and available. Yeah. So I have no hesitation in saying that it's a model that's quite broken. And computational design, to answer Zarin's question, is the science in architecture schools that will help us get out of this.
And for me, I don't know how to ask this question. It's a difficult question. It might portray me as naive, but I'll still ask it. And my apologies ahead of it. But why this project of documenting? For whom? Why are we documenting? And who is the audience?
I'll let Steve take the first question while I think about it, because that wasn't a naive question. That was
not at all. Not naive at all. It's a very good question, because I don't really know how to answer it. I mean, perhaps an anecdote. I mean, I assumed, and I should, full disclosure, I'm actually from Saskatchewan. I haven't lived there for a very long time, but I was born there. And I always assumed that because it is a population of immigrants, and only 1st or 2nd generation, maybe now 3rd generation, given my age away. So it's, to my mind, it's still very close. And my parents were immigrants, and I remember people would make fun of them because they had accents. And so it seems to me that with that kind of memory would still provide some kind of cohesion for the people who are living around there. But while we were documenting the Swedish church, we came across a gentleman who was the local, he's the political head of the municipality. So the term is a reeve. He was the reeve. And so I asked him, beside the Swedish church was a small cemetery. And I asked him, so will the municipality take care of this cemetery when this gentleman passes? The gentleman who was telling us about the 12-foot joists. And he said, no, we'll just plow it under. He said, there's no more of those people left, so there's nobody to take care of it. So, and I was absolutely flabbergasted that this person who should be nurturing that story wanted to erase it. So that anecdote, by way of saying, I hope there's someone, all I can say is I hope there's someone out there who's listening and who will keep that story alive.
Yeah, I think I can answer that question as well as the two questions that have popped up on my chat box from Kurt and Julie. I think they're linked in some ways, and that is that why do you do this? What's, what drives? In my case, it was very personal in the sense that I wanted to understand how an 1100-year-old building was so accurately made that I could not understand how in the 90s, this thing was built in 960 AD, and the level of precision and accuracy and thought and sophistication in every which way you look at it, construction, mathematics, formulation, geometry, many others, didn't seem to match the conditions that my society at that time in India was able to produce. They were not able to produce it. So they had lost in some sense, the ability to conceive and produce high quality artifacts. So that was the motivation. But in terms of answering the question for whom, it is really directed, you build for yourself and then you also build for others, right? But the question really is about the abstract nature of the work that we do. And that is to try and motivate people to look at past practices, to draw inspiration from, or even learnings from, whether it's environmental knowledge, the use of land, the way in which they maintained a certain kind of rigor. So, we had, for example, in the temples, 500 years of temple building, not much change in the plans, right? Now, somebody would tell me, oh, they didn't progress, right? So they built the same thing over and over and over again. It was just a cube, which had a little superstructure. It was a sacred object. It had meaning and a place in their society. But there was a certain consistency and a constancy about this that we don't have anymore. And I have shown you, in 100 years, we've gone from taking the first photograph in 1890 to absolutely, the other end of the stream in just 100 years. So I think, looking at documenting history and looking at the past gives you perspective into the future and the present. I think that's a very, very important point. And Steve related his own personal, immigrant story, which also, knowing your past is very important to understand your present and to know your future. It's very, very important. It's not just about looking back. It's also looking, forward.
That's great. I think there are some questions rolling in, which we'll take later, but I would ask Aki, Betul, Lauren, and Amanda if you would like to open up your question and answers to Steve and Samwit.
Yeah, so Dr. Fai, you demonstrated a lot of 3D development in your presentation. I would like to know how 3D printing has influenced your architectural thought process.
Yeah, well, early on, we looked at 3D printing, so additive fabrication and subtractive fabrication, and just compared those two. What we chose, the path we chose was the subtractive, as I had mentioned. So milling rather than printing. The reason for that was it was really a matter of scale. That when we made that decision, and of course there are economic consequences of making these kinds of decisions. When we made that decision, 3D printers were not available to print at the scale of an architectural element. And our research, again, working, and this is something I didn't touch on, but a lot of our work is introducing digital workflows into traditional workflows. So our work, for example, with Canada's Dominion sculptor. This was a person who, when we first met him about 10 years ago, was just working on his own. And he's a federal government employee, but one of the most brilliant sculptors I've ever had the pleasure of meeting or working with. And when we introduced him to the robots, he saw that as equivalent to an apprentice in Bernini's workshop. And we have a young woman who works with us who's become very adept with the robots and has developed a very close relationship with the Dominion sculptor. And he produces an object that he would like to fabricate. We digitize that object, and then he says, you know, I would like that twice as big as the sample I gave you. We can scale it up, and then Christine roughs it out with the robot to a certain level. And again, they're working together. They're exchanging images. Now we just exchange images. We used to actually talk to each other in person. And then he takes the fabricated piece, and as I was saying earlier, he finishes that by hand. So for us, again, we're able then to work at what I would consider an architectural scale, not a representational scale. But that said, of course, now there are 3D printers that can print, you know, sections of a building, and not just in polyvinyl, but in many different types of materials. So the landscape has changed, and 3D printing is something that I would be very interested in looking at.
Thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Tatta. When you're talking about the temples, did the studying process for different temples vary depending on different regions? And are there any set of methods that would allow us to study other ancient structures around the world?
Yeah, I think I'll answer that in two parts as you've asked it. Thank you for your question, Aki. So we did look at a large number of sites around South and Southeast Asia, and the methods that we use were exactly the same, the ones that I described to you today in very brief format, which essentially involved fieldwork documentation on site with a number of manual and digital techniques, and then taking it back. So the process that we had developed, or the methodology that I explained to you, you know, with the planar dissections and the parametric models and so on, including the three, they're all the same. But certain regions had very dilapidated structures, which I didn't show today. Some of the construction techniques didn't work there because, you know, the temple had basically come apart. You know, the stones had fallen apart and they had warped, they had settlement and so on. So if you did laser scanning there, and if you did the same techniques, you would end up with the result as it was in its current state of disrepair. Other temples had eroded to such a level that it didn't matter. You know, they were a lump of rubble. So you had to use different techniques to get there. They had trees growing out of it. So others, you know, but we were able to do informed reconstructions, you know, and using largely the same methods with some variation. what was interesting was to find the relationship to the typical, the as found, having a relationship to the canonical texts. And I think that was the really exciting part of our work, which we report in our book on digital archetypes, that almost all the temples had geometric and ritual relationships to the textual body of knowledge. So they were using manuals. They didn't have drawings. They didn't use the techniques that we use, a plan and section, but they use models, and they use these what I call algorithms, right? They're basically textual descriptions of what you need to do. So the second part of your question is basically answered by the same, that most of the techniques that people use are being used already, and different paths have developed the same. So if you go to China, for example, the focus is largely on laser scanning, because that's very accurate, and they have access to a lot of drone technology. And so if you look at the heritage modeling in China, it is very much, as Stephen described it, instrumental. It's like a surveyor going out there to document, right? So the concerns that we have about, Walter Benjamin or indeed, Karl Popper and verisimilitude may not be as relevant, because that's, so in India, for example, everything is done manually. They can take an entire temple apart and put it back together, So the role of such techniques is still very much in its infancy. There's no uniform method. It's a cultural practice, I'm trying to say. So the practice that I have learned to grow up with is also, it's not a universal practice, but certainly I think, a lot of temples and monuments across the world are having the same kind of development, and the tools have become so diverse now. You could do, which kind of photogrammetry would you like, and would you like fries with that? You get all of that. It's just amazing diversity. So it's not, you don't need to have a single technique anymore. So when I started photogrammetry, there was only one software in the entire world, and I think it was the American US Police Department had it, because they were reconstructing crashes, right? Very expensive piece of software, and we had to beg them to give it to us. So I guess the answer to your question is that technology progresses very fast, very, very rapidly. Cultural development is, by its nature, it's very, it accretes over time, it's slow. And so you can't really adopt one technique, because in about 5 years, you'll have to have a completely new set of workflows. And I think Stephen uses the word workflow. I think that's the right way, because you can plug and play things, and everyone will develop their own practice. And in your own work, as designers, you would be doing the same thing. You would be developing, and I love the word workflow, which is essentially gives you flexibility. You'll have modular pieces of kit, hardware, software, machines, and you would be able to do what is right for the job. Oh, there's one more thing that I wanted to add. Sorry, Aki. The separation of the architect from the construction process, I think, is really going away. And I think Stephen mentioned, being in Bernini's lab, or Bernini's apprentice, sorry. I think we're going back to that, in the sense that we're getting closer to the construction. So every question that I had, I didn't have drawings to go to, because as an architect, I'm trained to look at drawings, right? I would love to have had someone draw it all up. I had to engage with the physical object and make my own drawings. And I think everyone who studies history will find that the direct relationship between the designer and the object is what we're recovering. And that had been lost for a long period of time over the last 300-400 years, right? Where you had the representation controlling everything, and that's why, in my view, the BIM systems don't necessarily work, because it's, again, representational in nature. And I think the robotics will take over, because it has direct, the knowledge of design and construction. There's an immediacy to making something, right? And I think that could be universal, if you would like, that immediacy of working with an object. which frustrated me no end, as an architect, because, you wouldn't build a Boeing aircraft like that, where you make all the drawings and you hand it over to the contractor, and then the contractor then decides. You can't have the nose tip; it's too expensive. You replace it with something else, because the whole logic of this process is now being questioned, and I think we are moving to a new era where the representation will become secondary, and the immediacy will grow. So I think that's a very useful learning from technology and history. And historically, buildings are built like that. Very, very few representations. Representationally, it was quite light. But the knowledge was transferred with very direct engagement. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
I have a question for Dr. Spensai. I would like to know historically what has been the definition of a virtual reality, and how the virtual and the physical experiences are same or different.
I have a lot of problem with the term virtual. And the way it's used in the context of or I would say perhaps more popular conversations about virtual reality. A good friend of mine, Donald Kunze, wrote an essay, 20 years ago, something like that, where he actually argued that let me narrow it down to virtual reality and architecture. And he actually argued that architecture is always by its nature virtual. Because we are experiencing it and understanding it, but we're not actually part of it. So to use, if we take that understanding of the virtual as a kind of a given condition of human consciousness, it really doesn't make a lot of sense when we talk about putting on a headset. That would kind of actually be a virtual reality. So in our work, we try to avoid that term. And I mean, some of the work we do is also related to valorization and community engagement. And so, people come up to us and say, "Yes, we would like a virtual tour." And again, if you deconstruct the term, so do you want a tour, or do you want to be removed from the tour, and the tour is never actually realized? Like, what is it that you're asking for? So that said, the meaning of a word is how people use it. So these days, when I'm writing a grant, for example, I'll type in a word. I think of virtual reality. I'll type that in. What does Google tell me that means? Okay, I guess I better accept that. Even though it's not proper, I'm going to have to accept that, because someone reading my grant and writing grants and receiving grants is a big part of my life. Someone reading my grant is going, if they don't know what that term is, they're going to go to Google and they're going to type it in, and that's what the word means. So that's my conundrum about the term virtual and virtual reality.
That would call for another webinar, Steve. Definitely. And I think, Lorraine, you have another question, and probably just being heedful of the time, we'll take that question and a couple of the questions from the audience, which are similar. So we'll try and group them together. Lorraine?
Yep. So my next question was for Dr. Samwit. What can you say about the design process for these temples?
Oh, this is a great question. I could say a lot. I could probably even write a book on it, but I'll try to be brief. I think that the most exciting thing that I've learned is that it completely upended, understanding the design process of these temples, upended my entire architectural education, right? So I was trained in a modernist school, in Ahmedabad. Balkrishna Doshi was the fountainhead of all knowledge. And, there was a certain modernist ideology. And it was about the creative individual, that we were creative people and we invented things. It was very individual. And here I was studying objects that had, well, not a traditional sense of creativity. The creativity was very different. It was restrained creativity. The design process was more like music, as I describe it. So in music, you learn a certain set of rules. And then, it depends on which tradition, of course, you're talking about. But let's take classical music. And once you've mastered those rules, you're allowed to make some slight modifications. But of course, if you're, that's how it works. And the temple design process worked pretty much the same way. There were guilds of building. So most of the temple builders were really, associated with these guilds, which had this knowledge. And it wasn't creative at all. It was a lot of hard slog to just follow the rules, which were written down in canon, with slight minor modifications here and there, experimentation, we call it. So, so it was very rigid, the process, and it was collective. So the knowledge resided in the guild, not in the individual. Okay, so the design process itself was collective in some sense. And of course, after modernism, we try to, have participatory design, and we have, workshops, and we try to get away from the primacy of the individual and the creative individual. But it's very hard to do that, and what the temples tell me is that the design process is quite algorithmic in some sense. It's following a set of instructions. All these temples, from the smallest shrine, right up to the largest temples, which I didn't describe today, they're the size of cities. And some of the new work that we're doing is on a larger scale, like Stephen is. And they follow the same principles, which are established and are quite rigorously established. So my view is that it challenged my understanding of what creativity is and what the role of the individual is. And I guess that's why I'm in a school of computer science rather than a school of architecture. If that answers your question.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
The other thing that I want to add is that they didn't use drawing. So the primacy of the representation was gone. The primacy of the individual was gone. It was very algorithmic. In fact, it didn't take me very long to take those written texts, canonical texts, which was secret knowledge, by the way. So the architects didn't share it outside the guilds because the guilds received their commissions based on the clever work that they were doing, right? It was very easy to translate it into computer language, right? To make them algorithmic and to generate them, because if you follow the rules, you get the object. So the lack of and the engagement with the direct process of making, it was really a building process. It wasn't a design process, right? So my conclusion from that is, what did I learn from it? That it is a process of building. The process of building must be at the center of design. It must be a collective, and there must be an understanding of the convention in order for invention to take place.
Yes, schools of architecture are still trying to train geniuses.
Yeah, and you know what? Every school of architecture, and I had a big fight with my school, which is why I'm, on the doghouse. But the question is, you do 9 studios, right, with increasing level of complexity, and then you say you're an architect, right? And I just don't think that is the future. I think that the question you asked, Noreen, about the design process is a very, very key aspect of what I've learned. is that it's certainly, what we are doing with our curriculum and our pedagogy in terms of, we divide it into communication, history, design studio. Design studio is slightly bigger, maybe half the curriculum. And, computing, well, you could do a course in AutoCAD, maybe, just to drive, while you spend all your time in this doesn't fit with either the rapid changes in technology or with the historic models. This is a very unique, narrow model that we've adopted. And, it's something that we really need to question.
Anudarya, do you want to take up the question from Julie, please?
Yeah, so Julie Ivanov, she asked, as we use scientific research methods, frameworks into the emotional realm of humans, do you think there is a way to integrate this serendipity of human connections, nature into the digital and scientific realm? If anyone can answer.
First of all, I think it's not about scientific methods. I think it's about, well, the research methods and frameworks that we're using are really driven by something called information theory, right? That's the whole nature of this bit atom divide. And I would argue, as Herbert Simon did in the 1960s, that we're talking about the science of the artificial, right? He was a founder of artificial intelligence, but we're talking about not natural science, not social science, but artificial science, in the sense that we're talking about human-made objects. So any human-made object, by its definition, would have some sort of emotion in it, even if it's robotically made, as Stephen said, in his work, when it's human finished, there is the last piece is done by the human, right? So I think it automatically, in the work that we do, we integrate human emotion into what I would call the science of the artificial. And there's a great paper on design science by Herb Simon. I think it was written in 1960. And if you read that, you will get this, you will be able to separate, this conundrum between the scientific theories and the sort of emotional realm, or the humanist realm, because he proposes a third area of work, and that is to dealing specifically with objects that are human-made, made objects. So I think it's a really good question, but I would refer you to a higher authority. In this case, Herbert Simon, Sciences of the Artificial. Small book, very, very important in this particular area of work. So I would argue that the emotion is built in, but Stephen may have other ideas. Did you want to add to that, Stephen?
I would concur.
And
I think we have to get away from that distinction that emotion, is that there is this divide between the humanist and the scientific, because there is a lot of gray area, and we're in that gray space. Yeah.
Thank you, Samwit. I think we have just enough time to take one last question, which is from Kurt from University of Manitoba. Anthony, are you able to read that question?
You're on mute, Anthony.
I think you're muted, Anthony.
My bad. So Kurt's question is, as teachers, how would it be to balance the abstract aspects of digital documentation with the social and cultural practices and history of the places you are studying? And what should students be learning, and how could this change the pedagogy of architectural interior design education?
Just very briefly, I think one glaring aspect of architectural education that's missing, well, two things. One is an engagement with other human beings, an actual conversation with people. And certainly in the field work that we do, and as I had mentioned, I mean, that's when the buildings come alive. When you hear how they have touched other people's lives and what lives have touched them. And that's not something that we teach in school, in architecture schools. Buildings are precious objects that are the production of the genius of an individual. And that brings me to my second criticism, which is multidisciplinary collaboration. Because in fact, no building is the product of a single genius. And it's, what would be a appropriate adjective? It's dishonest for us to propagate that myth. One thing I'm very proud of at SIMS is that we have students from architecture, engineering, computer science, interactive media design, human-computer interaction, history, all working on projects together. And the architect is not in charge. The architect is part of the team. And that's something that not only schools of architecture, but academia generally cannot accommodate, even though there's a lot of lip service about multidisciplinary collaboration. No curriculum allows for it. So those are two things that, two correctives that I think should be brought to architectural education and education generally.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Steve and Samwit. That has been a wonderful conversation. And I wouldn't call this the end of our conversation, but probably the beginning of more conversations on this. I also want to thank the organizing team for all the hard work that they've put and the audience who've been great with the questions. The recording will be available later on our YouTube channel and a Facebook page. So feel free to go back and watch. And also, I would remind you that we have another one coming up on the 12th, where we'll be probably continuing this conversation with two other speakers, but working in the same realms. I'm hoping everyone can join in on that one as well. But thank you, Steve and Samwit. It has been a pleasure.
Thank you, Pallavi. Thanks to the organizing team and Samwit. It was great to touch base again, and I hope we can stay connected.
Absolutely. Thank you, Pallavi, for arranging a really wonderful series, and I'm privileged to be part of it and to meet with Stephen again virtually. We did meet briefly in Ottawa. And to your wonderful team, thank you very much for the questions and support, and I wish you all well.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.